Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. My name's Andy Robinson and I'm joined by Anne Whitten and Ed Shaw. We're a group of people who experience same-sex attraction. We're Christians and we want to help people in society and the church to wrestle with questions that emerge from that. Now, I'm looking at Anne and Ed, and all of us are getting our technology wrong at the moment. So, Ed, is your microphone still in one piece?
Yeah, my microphone keeps drifting round, and then the thing that stops me spitting into it keeps falling on the ground. But apart from that, I'm really ready to go.
Great. So I've just pressed play instead of record, so I was busy actually hearing my voice coming back at me rather than saying anything. Anne, are you just our technical genius? Have you done anything wrong yet?
I don't think I've done anything wrong, which kind of just sets me up for a fail, doesn't it? But I ought to know what I'm doing. I used to run a business teaching old people how to use iPods and stuff. So, yeah. Well, I'll carry you guys. Don't worry.
Thank you. I hasten to add, Ed and I aren't necessarily old people that you need to help, but we are showing the same attributes at the moment. But anyway, our main purpose is to wrestle with an important question in this series of the Living Out podcast. We're thinking through 8 big questions. And today's question is this: isn't God being unfair? If you're attracted to people of the opposite sex, then it's perfectly possible to have a marriage relationship, and that's great. But if you're attracted to people of the same sex, well, that's not available according to the Bible. Frankly, isn't that just unfair? That's our question for today. So, I want us to think through how we've personally handled this question, because I guess it might have struck us at different points in our life. So, is this a question either of you two have ever asked at any point? Isn't God just unfair? Ed, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there have been times in my life when I felt that God's really unfair in both, as it were, creating me to be somebody that's same-sex attracted, that's what it's felt like, or in saying no to same-sex sexual relationships. And I can remember some times when I've been, as a result of that, actually quite angry with God. And I can remember being particularly cross a number of years ago on holiday, and I felt that God was being unfair in denying me the beautiful guy of my dreams. And I can remember just being so actually taken aback by the anger that I felt inside, and actually being wonderfully comforted in the moment of that anger by a book I was reading, which was this really odd book to have on a beach on a holiday, which is where I was. And it's called Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices by a guy called Thomas Brooks. And I hadn't bought it in the beach cafe. You'll be, unsurprised to hear with that title. I brought it with me on holiday. It's a Puritan book, first published probably in the 17th century. And as I was having this fury with God, it just wonderfully reminded me that the God who loves me, the God who's in control of all things in my life, the God who is basically for me, is using everything in my life, including my same-sex sexual desires, including my same-sex attraction, to do good for me. And what felt in that moment like something that was really unfair, that I was cross with God about, just wonderfully through this book started to be something that actually I was grateful to God for, because I could see that he promises, and actually I can see how in many ways he actually has taken and used it to help me become more and more like him, to help me appreciate his love for me more and more.
I think for me, I wouldn't say that I wake up every morning with a sense that this is unfair, but probably similar to you, Ed, there would be sort of specific moments where, loneliness is bit, or possibly actually in the middle of a wedding reception as everybody is sort of getting together and dancing and I'm trying to work out what to do with myself. Just that moment of just, this is unfair. And I guess what's helped me is just the sheer realism of the Bible, actually. So, in this series, we'll look at loads of big questions. The Bible understands questions, actually. So in a context where you've got people coming to God saying, how long do I have to put up with this for in Psalm 13, or, God, why, Psalm 22? Actually, that's what's helped me, and I hope it helps others who are wrestling with these questions to say, actually, there is a God we can come to with these questions. To ask God, isn't this just unfair, is actually the kind of thing that a biblical spirituality would do. And so that's what's helped me is just, there is permission to wrestle with questions.
And just talking of the Psalms, I mean, Psalm 73 has been really helpful for me throughout my life when I've felt bitter and cynical, particularly when I look and as we often do, you see people who have rejected God's word and seem to be living really happy lives, and you've kept to God's word, and that doesn't seem to be the reality. And I love how Psalm 73 gives you words basically to have a bit of a strop with God, but then there's that beautiful moment when suddenly the perspective changes, the perspective of the psalmist changes, and the psalm helps you change your perspective and actually look at things from eternity. And actually see that, rather than, wouldn't it be better if ... you actually realise, actually, it is always better for me to live life God's way and to seek to honour him in the use of my body and my mind, my heart, my soul, my strength. So, I think the Psalms are a great place to go, particularly when we personally are feeling it's unfair. And Psalm 73, I recommend to loads of people who are asking this question in a whole host of different contexts.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Ed. Anne, have you got much experience of wrestling with this question?
I think a lot of my kind of wrestling was actually before I was a Christian. So I probably wouldn't have couched the question in terms of, isn't God being unfair? I just sort of felt that my state of affairs was unfair, So I was growing up in the kind of 80s and 90s when there wasn't much openness about sexuality, and I didn't really have anyone I could talk to about my same-sex attraction. And I sort of just felt quite lonely, quite marginalised, and a bit kind of why me, really. And I guess in that cultural context as well, I didn't have the hope of kind of marrying a woman or having children or anything like that. So it felt like, I was giving up a lot already, as a teenager. It's funny because when I became a Christian, in a way, it was a massive relief. I mean, sexuality was the big deal for me. So I kind of, I realised that the Bible teaches quite clearly about sexuality in a marriage between a man and a woman. And so I kind of knew when I became a Christian what I would be giving up. And I mean, the thing is, I didn't have to be a Christian. I didn't have to follow Jesus. No one was forcing me to. I could have just gone off and, got a girlfriend and lived somewhere in suburbia and done whatever I wanted with my life. But I felt like what Jesus was offering me was just something better, and what he'd done for me in dying on the cross, that kind of put everything into perspective, so I think at the point of becoming a Christian, I didn't feel like it was unfair of Jesus to ask everything of me, considering what he'd done for me. I've had various times since then where it's felt a bit kind of unfair. I've seen friends get married and stuff, and even there are, obviously straight people who are single and would like to be married, but there's always that hope, isn't there? Whereas for me, it was, this is a lifelong commitment. But then I think, to be honest, life is intrinsically unfair. I mean, there's lots of things that aren't fair about life. I think I'm quite lucky in that I was born in the UK. I had a really good upbringing, nice education, never been particularly ill. There are lots of people who are a lot worse off than me. And I think the thing that makes sense of the unfairness of life is the transcendent God. That will put everything right, and the fact that this life isn't it, and that there is a world beyond this, I think puts everything else into perspective, and that really helps me with anything that I'm feeling is unfair in my day-to-day life.
Any other things that have helped us as we've wrestled with this?
Well, just growing older. So I'm now in my mid-40s, and it was very easy in my mid-20s to see friends getting married and to think they were living, the the only joyful life and I was going to have a miserable one because I wasn't married. And actually, I've seen how marriage can be really hard. And some of my friends who are married have had a much harder life because they're married than I have had because I'm single. And so actually that's been quite a helpful corrective to my life's passing moment by that is the better life. I've actually found out that no, singleness is good. That's something we keep on saying on this podcast because it's an important thing to hear, because singleness is good and it brings many joys. It brings its own sadness, but many joys as well. And often it's much easier to be single than to go through a lot of the trials and angst and heartache that marriage can be in many cases.
Yeah, I feel the same about having children as well. I've gone through various stages in my life. I think initially not wanting to even think about children because that was off the cards for me and it was sort of too painful to think about. And then going through a period where, I really kind of grieved for not having children and really missed that. And, now I'm really enjoying the fact that I don't have children and I don't have to change nappies and deal with, not being able to get enough sleep and all that kind of thing, and all the heartache that my friends have to deal with. So, for me, there's been it's been very much ages and stages, but I think in my mid-40s now, I'm enjoying being single and not having children and not seeing that as a loss, but as an opportunity.
And you're not in your mid-40s. You must be in your mid-30s.
Oh, every week, come on.
I think we've concluded all of us within about 12 months of each other. But it's funny, though, isn't it? I think we sort of have a sort of picture in our minds that, marriage is ultimate happiness, not being married, not being in a relationship is misery. Whereas often as I see friends, actually, I think to be in the position I'm in is much easier than being in a really difficult marriage or a difficult relationship.
Yeah, and I often have people say to me, "Oh, but Ed, you're going to die alone. It's really unfair that you're going to die alone." And I used to be polite in response to that. I now tell everybody that most people die alone. In a marriage, a husband or wife dies first, and this whole idea that everybody dies with their family gathered around them. Most people die alone. The great thing about being a Christian is that actually nobody dies alone. You've got Jesus with you, and that's just true for me as a single person. As it's true for them as married people. And
I'm glad you added the last bit. I was beginning to think the Living Out podcast isn't great for morale, but yeah, it's. But it is right, and I guess it's just the sort of realism of life is. In a sense, there will be challenges for all of us, but actually it's beginning to press into the Lord in the midst of that.
Yeah, and none of this makes sense without an eternal perspective. I mean, if this life is all there is, then yeah, I think I would feel like I was really missing out if I wasn't in a relationship and maybe didn't have kids and stuff, if I just died and that was it. But the fact that that there is a life beyond this, and that now a lot of the things that I'm investing in my relationship with Jesus, those are things that are going to last forever. That makes me feel like I'm not missing out on anything. And in fact, sexual relationship is really not the be all and end all.
Yeah, and I've had a number of people in my life say to me, "How come you've got so many friends? How come you've got so many people, and you're in so many good friendships and relationships that bring health, variety to your life?" And I often say to them, "It's because I'm not married." I think we often forget as single people that married people are often looking at the lives of single people and thinking it's not fair. They seem to have so many more friends. They seem to be able to do so many more things. They seem to have freedoms that I do. You can spin the question round, and actually so often I found again and again and again that it's the single people that I know, it's myself as a single person that have actually more intimacy in our lives because the range of relationships that we've got, the range of friendships that we've got, than a lot of people that I know who have thought unwisely that one other person will satisfy all their needs. And I think some of them may be saying to us at the moment, well, it's a bit unfair that I'm married and that you single people get to enjoy so many more different sorts of friendships, relationships as a godfather, as an uncle, whatever it might be for me. It's probably worth thinking some people look in on my life, your lives, and think, oh, it's unfair that they get to enjoy so many different sorts of relationships because we're single. So you can spin the question around in any number of ways and come up with very different answers.
That's definitely the case. I've got married friends who've said to me, "I wish I was single." You know, so,
Name them.
yeah.
Name them now. Name them now.
Oh gosh, no, I definitely wouldn't do that. But yeah, I think it's very easy, and I think I read this in one of Sam Albury's books. But it's very easy to compare kind of the worst of singleness with the best of marriage. But actually, you know, we all know that marriage is really tough, and sometimes you end up married to someone who, quite frankly, you don't really get on that well with, and you know, you're stuck with them, and it could be really tough. It could be really lonely. Married people need friends and need intimacy that they often don't get. So, yeah, I don't think I would swap my life, even if, you know, someone said, "Oh, would you like a, you know, sort of married and 2.4 kids?" No, thanks. I'm having far too much fun with all my friends.
So you've heard it here on the Living Out podcast. If you're married, you'll have no friends and you'll die alone anyway. But I mean, I guess we all want to say there are good things in marriage as well. You know, there are going to be trials in both ways. So I guess we've sort of all wrestled with the question in different ways and found different answers, partly actually seeing the benefit of asking questions and I guess actually the benefit of when you face questions like that, rather than turning away from God, you actually go back to God with the question. We've sort of experienced actually just the goodness of God, recognize that actually this is just part of life, that life isn't always fair, and so we trust him with those things. But I guess as well as a personal question for us, it's just a question that sort of runs through society wrestling with this, you know, which is why I guess you have sort of campaigns for equal marriage, because there's that view of, well, actually it just isn't fair to allow certain people to get married and not others. And I guess in the second part, what we'll explore is how we might answer that question.
You're listening to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. For more stories, resources and events, visit our website at livingout.org.
Let's come back then to thinking about this broader question, because I guess it's a question that runs through society as a whole. And you know, the reason there's been a pressure for equal marriage is because of a sense that it's unfair if that's not the case. How would we respond to that? Any reflections on that question?
Well, if I was talking to an unbeliever and we were talking about society in general, I would want to say that there have been times when society has been really unfair in how it's treated sexual minority groups. And, you know, one of the things that society has woken up to in the last, 20 years are the very unfair treatments they have meted out on LGBT people down the years. And probably it's just important to always say that we need to recognise how unfair human beings have been towards other human beings who happen to be gay, same-sex attracted. And I don't want to distinguish, though, between that and the behaviour of the God who's made us, who has not been unfair to LGBT minorities over the years. He's always been kind and loving and generous to us in creating us, in giving us the good gift of sexuality, of giving us really good advice on how to use our bodies sexually in a way that will bring us and others most happiness and enjoyment long term, and that is to keep marriage for the marriage of a man and a woman. So I just love how fair God has been consistently down the centuries, even when humanity itself has been deeply unfair towards people like me. And I just love, God has never discriminated against LGBT people in calling them to himself. There have been, gay, same-sex attracted believers all the way down the centuries. God has never had you can't come anywhere near me, when in countless times and contexts, other institutions, other religions, other human beings have said to people like me, no entry. God has never said no entry. God has always welcomed people from sexual minorities in. And that's why, evidence for that in somewhere like that Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Paul recognizing the church in Corinth, people like us, people who are same-sex attracted, people who are gay, part of the early church. And so, God's got a pretty good track record in fairly welcoming in people like us, which is great news.
And that might be worth underlining for somebody listening to this who might be in the position of saying, I'm gay, I'm same-sex attracted, maybe even feeling some degree of unease about that. Am I welcomed, accepted by God? Well, praise God through the cross, through the Lord Jesus, absolutely. And, there is that fundamental equality and fairness in the way that God treats us.
And I suppose that's exactly right, isn't it? God treats us all equally, and he demands sexual purity from us all equally as well. So he doesn't apply a double standard. He doesn't ask gay people to jump through more hoops than straight people. He calls us all to this standard that says, this is the context for sexual relationship that I've ordained, and any sex outside that by whoever isn't what I want for you. So one of the things that we seem to have sort of adopted is this idolization of sexual relationship, in that everybody has a right to sexual expression, everyone has a right to a sexual relationship. And I think that's a bit of an unhelpful way of looking at things, because if that is the case, then yeah, we should be opening up marriage to everybody. But I think that's a kind of unhelpful way to look at sex. I think, marriage is a gift that is given to some people. Singleness is a gift that's given to some people. And both those are good things that can be used to honour God and to flourish in life. But yeah, if we start thinking of sex as something that's kind of necessary for being a full flourishing human being, or a proper adult, or anything like that, or be something that we're entitled to, I think that's where we get a bit unstuck.
And the other thing about God, when it comes to saying to people like us, you shouldn't have sex, you need to live a celibate single life, what I love is the fact he's done it himself. Yeah. I can't go to God and say, you don't know what it's like, because in Jesus, he has lived a celibate, sex-free life. He knows what it's like to be a single person in a society in which everybody was sort of paired off, in which there would be a very high view of sex. And so, he's not been unfair in asking me to do this, because he's done it himself. And again, I just love that about Jesus, as he looks me in the eye and says, yeah, you need to keep sex for the marriage of a man or woman, as I did. You need to not have sex, as I did. And I just love the fairness of that God's willing, as it were, to set rules that he's also willing to keep himself.
And I guess you just have the sort of consistency as well, that for all people, there will be elements of aspects of life that they find hard, that actually God has purposes in. For all of us, there'll be elements of desires that we have that we're called to say no to, that will be true for all of us as well. And actually, for all of us, the ultimate rewards are worth it. So, I guess one of the things we've talked about quite a lot of this podcast is the way in which marriage functions as a trailer pointing forward to eternity, to the sort of ultimate marriage between Jesus and the church, the sort of great love story that's at the heart of the Bible. And I think for me, the thing I sort of hold on to is actually, because of that, for 99.9999% of my existence, I will be married, if you like. I'll be part of the church, married to Jesus. And so in a sense, the amount of unfairness, if there is unfairness, is pretty short, actually, when you compare it with eternity and the ultimate satisfaction that is available to us. And so part of me just wants to say, ultimately, there's no unfairness here, because what's offered to all of us, irrespective of our sort of sexuality, it is just so wonderful.
And if you think about what other Christians have had to give up as well, I think we're so obsessed with sex that we think giving up sex is the biggest thing you could ever do, and how can anyone live without sex? And yet, I don't think it is such a big deal that we make it out to be. I'm really privileged to be in a church with some wonderful Iranian refugees, and they have given up their home, their culture, their families, their lifestyle, their possessions, their sense of identity, everything, to come and live in a country which is quite often quite hostile towards them, where they don't know anyone. They've given up all that because they love Jesus. And that's quite humbling. It sort of puts me in my place a little bit and just makes me think, blimey, I've hardly given up anything compared to these people. And there are Christian brothers and sisters all over the globe who are giving up their lives to follow Jesus. So I think it's a wake-up call to us here in the West, that if we feel like God's demanding too much of us, it's just pause to think again, isn't it, when we think about the joyful way that people are willing to give up everything to follow him.
I guess for me, the sort of appeal I'd want to make for those who are tempted to sort of give up on God because of this, part of me would just want to say, don't make sexuality the big thing. So it might be you're in the position of saying, well, because I'm worried about what God says about sexuality, I'm just going to give up on God. And part of me wants to say, actually, the bigger question is who God is, as you look at Jesus, is there enough to trust him? And as you see his love, his compassion, his mercy, his self-sacrifice on the cross, part of me wants to say, okay, I might sometimes wrestle with what he says about sexuality, but actually there's enough there. There's enough in what I see about God in Jesus that actually I'm going to trust him, that what he says about sexuality is ultimately right, even if at the moment I'm struggling with it. Part of me wants to say, argue from who God is back towards sexuality, rather than making sexuality the big thing and letting that distort your image of God. So even if you maybe do wrestle with the question, is this unfair? Don't let that be the thing that drives you away from God, because all we see of him in Jesus is so beautiful and so wonderful.
I think that's really important for your own spiritual health as well. I find it when asked the question, when I'm asking, is God good? Yeah, as you say, the best place to go is to Jesus, and particularly actually Jesus' death on the cross, which assures me of God's goodness. And actually, when that makes God's goodness so clear that when perhaps what he says about sexuality or any number of things seems really hard, that's the most reassuring place, as it were, to return to go back to the default setting. That reassures us when we struggle with it, with questions of fairness, which we're always going to struggle with in some shape or form.
I find that scripture really helpful. Someone will tell me where it is, but the bit where Jesus says, if your son asked you for some bread, would you give him a snake?
Matthew 7, I think.
It is, yeah. Can't remember the exact reference, but I love that, because it's talking about a loving and trustworthy father. And sometimes I don't understand why God says what he says, but I know that what he says isn't arbitrary and it is for my good. And that knowledge comes from trusting his character, knowing that he's my good father.
Part of it is just saying we don't want to buy into the narrative that says sexuality is the most important thing in the world, and that's what matters. I often think when it comes to the whole issue of sexuality, in the end, it comes back to what do I think is at the center of the universe, me and my desires, or God and his goodness. And actually, when I'm thinking, right, God and his goodness will be at the center of the universe and life will begin to make sense, it's only actually when I say sexuality and desires associated with that is the be-all and end-all that actually life gets distorted. Life's at its best when I realise God is good, he's at the centre of the universe, and I can trust him.
I guess that in some ways the question's not, is God unfair, but it is God loving? Because actually, I think God is loving in saying to me, do not pursue sexual relationships with other men, because the sort of sexual relationships I want to pursue with other men aren't me settling down to live in sort of a nice sort of permanent, faithful, stable relationship. That's not what my desires actually lead me to. The sort of relationships I'm wanting are probably quite promiscuous, ever changing, not permanent, unstable, and actually would probably involve a high degree of unfaithfulness. And so a God that says to me, you shouldn't do that, is not being unfair. He's actually being really loving, because I'm not created to flourish as a human being in that sort of context. That's actually what I want. And God, in saying, no, you can't have that, is being... it might be being unfair as some people define it, but what it's actually really being is loving and saying to me, no, that's not good for you. It won't be how you flourish. let me show you an alternative way, which is just the way that I live life in Jesus.
For me, I really wanted the kind of settle down and, long-term committed relationship. And actually, I did have that at one point, but I kind of felt like that's what I'd always dreamed of as a teenager, little kid. And when I got what I want, I felt a bit like there's a quote from Oscar Wilde, isn't there, that there are two tragedies in life. One is not getting what you want, and the other is getting it. And I kind of had everything I always wanted and realised that it didn't fulfil the deepest longings that I had. And actually, what I was looking for was something that only God could give me. So I think, in a sense, if you're looking for that fulfilment, that intimacy and that relationship that only God can give you, whether you're looking for that in a same-sex relationship or an opposite-sex relationship, you're going to be disappointed. And I think the same as Ed said, I think God was being loving and kind to me, to pointing me toward himself, rather than letting me settle for less, letting me settle for a relationship with a woman, when actually what I could have is a relationship with the living creator of the universe who loves me perfectly. So I feel like I've been sort of rescued from a Hollywood romance that overpromises and underdelivers, and I've been given something so much better.
Well, thanks for listening to this podcast as we've explored this question. Do subscribe and rate us if you like us, and do tune in for the next episode. But I thought I'd end just by quoting the words that Ed referred to from Psalm 73, which remind us why, even if sometimes we struggle with what God teaches on sexuality, we know that he is good and worth following. Yet I am always with you. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, and afterwards you will take me into glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Thanks for listening.